You are coming in with a state of radical self-responsibility for honoring your body where you're at and realizing like I'm taking an individual approach to this because it's my body, because it's my health, it's my wellness, and I know how to be connected to my body. Welcome to the Freely Rooted podcast, where we are passionate about helping women reclaim their metabolisms, restore their youthful vitality, and rediscover God's original design for motherhood and wellness.
We are your hosts, Fallon and Kori, and we're so glad you're joining us for season 4. If you're new here, be sure to listen to our previous episodes where we talk through many of our favorite foundational topics. Now grab your favorite nourishing drink and join us as we continue discussing simple, attainable, and life-changing approaches to wellness. All right, welcome back to the Freely Rooted podcast. We are so excited to dive into a brand new season and cannot wait to share all of the amazing content we've got planned for the rest of the year. First, you guys haven't heard from us in a while, so why don't we talk about our summers and what we've been up to? It's been pretty low-key around here. I had full intentions of doing year-round schooling. I do homeschool, and I thought I was going to be the mom who schooled all through the summer. We didn't, but that's great. It's actually the break that we needed. We did a lot of traveling and resting, and Kori and I have done a lot of brainstorming for the fall. So that's been super exciting. Kori, what have you guys been up to over the summer?
Yeah, it was going to be a pretty restful summer as well. And then a bunch of amazing opportunities came up for continued education and some mentorship programs for my husband and I actually to go through together. And so we're continuing mentorship under Michelle Chatham. She came on the podcast on the tongue tie episode. And then I'm continuing education with her to learn more of the technique, the fascial care technique. Besides that, it's been really exciting to plan the retreat. As you guys know, if you didn't see our announcement about this will be a retreat. Our first ever retreat will be in Waco, Texas in December. And so we've been planning the details of that. And besides that, just a lot of outdoor time and surfing and sun and all the good things. So it's been an amazing summer. I'm excited to dive back into this.
Yeah, for sure. Also, I have to laugh at the differences in our summers. I feel like you had this very whimsical, aesthetically pleasing summer. And in Texas, it's been literally 108 degrees. And it's we can't go outside. So I feel like we've lived different lives over the summer, but I'm excited for fall. Like Kori said, we have the retreat coming up. We have not launched a lot of details around that. So you're not missing anything if you're I haven't heard about this yet. Just keep an eye on our Instagram and email blast. We will be opening registration and sharing some more information on that soon. And then today, we are so excited to cover what feels like a really pressing and important discussion just around all of the dogma and misunderstandings that we find surrounding the, pro-metabolic sphere. Because the truth is, I feel like, Kori, you and I both have almost distanced ourselves from this verbiage because anything with an official title can easily start to feel kind of cultish, and it's too black and white. It's too exclusive. That's not what we perceive this lifestyle to be. And so we want to break down some of those misunderstandings today because in truth, there really is a lot of gray area when it comes to healing your metabolism. And a lot of the conversations in this realm need to be very nuanced, and sometimes they aren't. Mm-hmm. So we want to try to break down some of our own opinions here and then just talk about the practical definition of the phrase pro-metabolic. Really, it can be simplified as, does this support your metabolism? Pro-metabolism. That's all it means. It's really that simple. So yes, there are principles that can across the board support metabolic health. So, things like reducing our stress load, getting enough bioavailable minerals and nutrients. And then there are some subjective ideas that will probably vary a bit based on who you are. So, your personal calorie needs, your macronutrient targets, what stressors do you need to change in your life? What exercise is the most supportive and enjoyable for you? Those things are a little bit more individualized. And so we don't want to put these blanket statements on top of any of these topics that really need to be based on who you are and what your environment is. So today, like I said, we're going to cover what we perceive to be some of the most misunderstood topics or maybe misinformed approaches that we see in the metabolic sphere. Kori, do you want to kick us off with the first one?
Absolutely. And I think the first thing to kind of preface this with is just how much we appreciate and honor the individual and how much we honor you, everyone that is listening. And we also want to honor where you're at whenever you're coming into this space. And so that's why we've cultivated this podcast in a way where in the beginning, it is really simple and it's really practical, and it's kind of meeting the woman or man where they're at, as far as like maybe coming out of a space where you're used to someone giving you the rules. And we kind of ease you from a place where it's rules to a place that's more nuanced and gray. And we hope you guys appreciate that process, because you can honor yourself where you're at. We can't just tell you, hey, stop thinking in the black and white. We know where you're at because we've been there. And I actually just posted a story that Paris Hodges posted on her story yesterday. I like reposted it, and it said nuance is like a result of being, minerally balanced and metabolically healthy. To even get to that place where you can even think that way is a result of your regulation and your groundedness and your capacity. And so the first thing we want to talk about is just this idea of metabolic health and the metabolic health approach not being this black and white, all or nothing approach. However, we can see how someone might come in and then be stuck in that black and white state and then walk away from it, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as opposed to realizing, wait, this says more about me and where I'm at than where this approach is taking things in general, if that makes sense. And we talk about this on the episode with Josh and Jeannie Rubin. If you guys have listened to that, hopefully this is not the first episode you're listening to. If you're coming in, if it is, I highly encourage you to go back to the very first episode, but then working your way through. And even where we placed Josh and Jeannie's episode, it's called Has Your Pursuit of Health Become Unhealthy? Even where we placed that episode in our seasons was very particular for the people who might have come into this approach, like I said, and that are still in that black and white state. And they kind of introduce our audience to this idea of, hey, when you're in a state of undernourishment and stress, and when your nervous system is on fire, you're going to cling to rules, and rules help us feel safe. And it's just this idea of also coming back and examining your childhood story as well. This is why the conversation around like respectful parenting and our approach to wellness go hand in hand. Because if you grew up in more of maybe an authoritarian, maybe a hyper-religious household, which is many of you, because our generation was raised this way by the previous one, you might be familiar with this idea of someone being called, a good girl if you follow the rules, or a bad girl if you break them, and just being in these very like fundamentalist boxes. And the alternative to that would be if you grew up with loving and firm boundaries that are enforced with, developmentally appropriate natural consequences, with, connection and love at the center. Meaning in practical terms, you're not teaching your child you're a bad person, you're a bad girl if you are having a hard time, with these boundaries. So with the reality that most of us grew up in a black and white kind of lens to life, it makes perfect sense how we have sought safety as adults by looking for black and white rules. And this is why it's fantastic marketing for a lot of these programs that are out there, and why people flock to dieting every single year. Statistically, we know that 95% of people that go on a diet gain all that weight back and then repeat every single year. And so, yeah, it's fantastic marketing. It's a fantastic approach to get people to feel triggered and fearful, and then go and be in this state where you're following the rules because it keeps you disconnected to your body. You're not actually asking yourself, like, how does this food make you feel whenever you have a list of foods that you can and can't eat, So a lot of people that are coming to our pages and then, coming to our podcast for the first time, you are coming and asking us, okay, can you just tell me the foods? Just tell me the foods, give me the rules. And then, you jump in 100 miles per hour into what you might be calling a metabolic health journey, but it's just where you're at right now. And like I said, again, we honor that. We honor the fact that you might be just swapping your old diet plan for a new diet plan and then staying disconnected from your body because your brain is going, I have to do everything right. You have to feel safe. You have to feel like you're a quote, good girl, a good person by following the rules. And so all of this to say, like, let's say I'm sharing a testimonial on my Instagram stories from a course student. I'm not sending people to my course, even though it's a testimonial for my course. I'm actually not sending people to my course. I go, hey, this is where you start. You start with the podcast. You start with the free guide. Start with the very simple and practical steps that are going to kind of build up that capacity slowly, so that way, if you do want to do a deep dive into metabolic health, you're not going in the dysregulated state where you're wanting to do everything all at once, where that can typically lead to a lot of weight gain. We're going to have that conversation here as well. And also just this idea of maybe getting frustrated if you're not seeing results right away, or you're coming up with other symptoms and you just go, oh, it's not working. I'm just going to stop doing it and then go back to my old ways. So yeah, the metabolic health approach is not this all or nothing approach. It is an individual case by case approach. And we are teaching you how to do that. And I'm especially teaching you to do that in my course, is taking an individual approach. And so, yeah, just being able to say, okay, I may have in the past kind of flocked to these more orthorexic type approaches where you're just calling any food bad. This is something you can pay attention to. If there are accounts out there that are calling whole foods bad and toxic and calling them like truth bombs, that might be a little bit of like orthorexic thinking. And so you can see how maybe your past self might have been like, ooh, I got to go listen to this. Whereas now you're like, wait a second, why are we doing this? Like, why are we calling foods bad and good? And yeah, so we just need to, like I said, just honor where we're at and realize that if we are looking for the black and white, it may say more about where we're at right now than the metabolic health journey in general. So yeah, this is why I care, and this is why it matters, and this is why Fallon really cares, and why it matters to her, where if you come into one of our products, you are coming in with a state of radical self-responsibility for honoring your body where you're at and realizing like, I'm taking an individual approach to this because it's my body, because it's my health, it's my wellness, and I know how to be connected to my body. So anyways, this is not all or nothing, because what even is all? No one holds all the answers. We are all having our own version of, self-experimentation, interpretation of research, study of our physiology, and then also what resonates with us as individuals. And then those who are content creators package that up for you into a product and tell you to find what works for you within that framework. So yeah, it's highly individualistic and not authoritarian. And what's funny is when I've seen people kind of slap black and white rules onto the metabolic health approach, I always think of Dr. Ray Peat, who is largely someone who has inspired a lot of this interpretation of his work into the metabolic health space. And I just think like, what would he think of like this idea of, I've seen like a nutrition review that was like the metabolic health approach, an honest review or something like that. And it was calling the metabolic health approach like a requirement to eat gallons of ice cream and orange juice. And I'm just like, no one's saying that. No one is saying that. So anyways, speaking of food, Fallon, you being kind of like the recipe queen, where have you seen, where have you seen this conversation come up with food in your own audience as far as like the black and white approach?
I mean, to start with, not a probably day or week goes by where I don't get a question from someone asking, can I eat this food, or is this food bad? And it just is this prevalent thought process, like you said, that there's some list that exists out there, regardless of what sphere you step into, where you have to check off all the good and bad foods. And so that's probably the most common question I get in terms of food is, is this supportive? Is this not? And then we have to get into the conversation, because a lot of people stepping into this do come from dogmatic backgrounds, myself included. And so a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today are actually very much relevant to my own journey. So when you hear, for example, that, raw vegetables maybe aren't the best metabolic support, what people do is then they hear that and they go, okay, no more vegetables now. And that's what people do. And that's what I did. I mean, I did it. And so I can say that this is a common thing that happens. So, we hear things like raw veggies and, cruciferous veggies can often contain anti-nutrients. It makes them a little bit harder to break down, especially when they're not cooked. And, we hear things like that plant nutrients are absorbed at almost half the rate of animal nutrients. All of this is true. Okay. All of this is true. That doesn't mean that you just see kale and you see, I don't know, cauliflower or whatever, and you run. I got to be honest. I don't know that I really want to consume a ton of kale and cauliflower. But the point is here that a lot of people hear these ideas that, raw veggies, cruciferous veggies, maybe they're not as supportive as you thought they were. And so now they say, okay, well, I'm just not going to eat any vegetables. That's not really what we're saying.
Mhm.
So again, I don't personally find myself craving like a giant bowl of cauliflower or kale like I probably would have eaten in the past. But I do often hear people say that they feel guilty because they transition to a pro-metabolic lifestyle and now they're like, oh, I'm really craving a salad or broccoli. And I'm like, okay, then eat it. Like nobody told you that you can't eat those things. We've just
Mhm.
decided that because someone said, hey, there's a better choice. Like, here's the deal. Animal products, liver, oysters, organ meats are the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. Does that mean you should never look at a vegetable? No. Everything has its place in your diet. You should still include these things. You can still include these things. Figure out how to make them supportive for your personal digestion. So cook them in butter, eat them with plenty of carbs and protein. If you want to have a big salad, have a big salad. Just see how your body responds. Nobody is saying that you can't do this anymore. The problem is that these are not bad foods. The issue is it's like our culture has this weird obsession about tons of vegetables, right? We have this weird obsession with like eating salads for every meal, having these giant like cruciferous veggie bowls. None of this has a historical basis. In fact, broccoli was human engineered from cabbages and
Mhm.
wouldn't have even existed like thousands of years ago. Okay, so this is a weird obsession that we have with like trying to do this volume eating approach where like all we eat is vegetables. So when we shy away from vegetables, we really miss out on things like squashes and root veggies that can be really supportive. Beets are incredible for your liver. Root veggies, obviously, we talk about carrot salad all the time. That's an incredibly supportive food. But what happens, and I saw this happen in myself, when you avoid things like potatoes and rice and other starches for so long, you suddenly hear that they're okay again. You know, they're back in that yes column, and you go just wild on them. And that's what I did. That's what I see people do
Mhm.
because they didn't have potatoes and rice and starches for so long. Now they see that they're, back on the menu. And we transition to this like, I'm going to replace every single vegetable that I ever ate. And I'm not going to eat any of those again. And I'm only going to eat potatoes and rice. Again, nobody has
Totally.
said to do this, but it's easy to do that because, again, we come from this dogmatic way of thinking that we hear like, oh, potatoes and rice and grains are back on the table. And so we get rid of all of our root veggies like sweet potatoes, parsnips, beets, squash. Those are all amazing for our digestion and our blood sugar, and we should still be including them. But I know that so many of you listening can relate to me in this, that we finally discovered that these things were okay to be in our diet. And we heard that, some veggies are kind of maybe not supposed to have like as big of a place as they do. And we just like completely flip the script and we completely turn the diet that we were already following on its head and do it in the exact opposite manner. So like instead of avoiding all carbs and starches, I'm going to make that my sole source of vegetables and I'm going to avoid all of the other ones. That's not what this approach is about. And then again, the other big way that I see this sort of black and white thinking flesh out is all of the messages about, is XYZ food bad? So most commonly that's about, are beans bad or lentils bad or grains bad? And my typical response is that I don't call real food bad. That's just not how I'm going to function on my platform. Yes, it matters how you're prepping this stuff. And yes, certain things need to be evaluated through a historical lens in terms of frequency, amount. So that's why you'll hear us say things like, a half a cup of nut butter doesn't really have historical basis. What people hear out of that is that nuts are bad.
Mhm.
And that's not what we're saying.
Mhm.
And that's what I did when I entered this space. I saw all of this about, too much PUFA consumption and too many processed almond products. And then I just avoided nuts and seeds like the plague. And it wasn't until recently that I started craving Brazil nuts. And I was like, I had this internal battle of like, oh my gosh, can I eat Brazil nuts because they're a PUFA? And I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like, this is not the approach that we're trying to pursue. And so I got some Brazil nuts and I've been having some and they're amazing. And like, this is the thing that we have to keep in mind is that food is about context. So like nuts are not bad. Is it probably a bad choice to be eating a cup of nut butter in a week? Maybe so. I don't know. Evaluate your own body. But I get asked daily if things like, cassava, liver, adrenal cocktails, bee pollen, all these things are like, quote, okay for this or that condition. And I'm like, I don't know. Are they? Are they working for you? Like, how do you feel? But we're just not going to reduce foods to like a good and bad list. It's just not helpful.
Yeah, and I hope you guys can kind of see the themes of our culture within this with the good and bad conversations and just using those words to describe anything and everything and putting things in those categories. And
Mm-hmm.
I really like that you said the word guilt, because guilt has been used as almost a principle, almost a virtue, I would say, in the fundamentalist way of thinking in the Western church, even of just like this idea of feeling guilt. Like, what is that rooted in? And being able to realize if we're going to bring in, the religious conversation into this, like so many people are hung up on the idea of sin and bad, 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 and we are bad, 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 as opposed to like focusing on the wholeness and the sonship and just what Jesus has actually asked us to step into and what he has invited us to step into. And we can't get out of this way of thinking of I am so bad, if that makes sense. And another thing to think about is that it's not just with the conversation with food. Obviously, this goes into all areas of life. And so let's say that you find out that your running a mile a day is not serving your body right now. And so you're like, oh, I'm just going to completely cut out working out. No one asked you to cut out working out. No one asked you to cut out movement. It's like that would be the same logic as maybe finding out that the water that you're drinking is not mineral rich. And so you're like, well, I'm just going to stop drinking water then, as opposed to let's add in the supportive water into our bodies, into our systems, into our daily rhythms that is mineral rich. There is so much supportive movement that we can do for ourselves as well. It doesn't have to be a mile of running a day. And it could be that once you get into a more resilient state, you want to start running again because you crave it and you crave the movement of it as opposed to using it as a stress release. If you're addicted to it because it's a stress release, like that can be a window into, okay, what am I actually using this movement for, as opposed to moving because you love your body and moving because you want to honor it. And so, yeah, just getting out of this idea of cutting out everything because one thing is not supportive for your body right now is a really good practice of just being able to be like, I don't have to cut everything out. And, I talked about this actually on a live that I did with my husband last week or the week before on his metabolic health journey. And something that I brought up is something that I've observed in my course students. And I said, I was like, I don't have any like science to back this up. I just have observation. And what I've found in my course students is there are certain phases of healing where, let's say that you decide canola oil is not going to be in my house anymore. I'm going to make a big effort to cut out canola oil or vegetable oils out of my diet. And then about a month in of you cutting out vegetable oils, which by the way are not a food. So I don't have any hesitancy being like, hey, that's a pretty easy thing to cut out because it's not actually a food. But let's say you are about a month in of not consuming a lot of vegetable oils, and then you go out to a restaurant and you have something that's like laden with vegetable oils and you feel like absolute garbage. This happens so much in the initial phases of healing that I hear about in my course students, where it's like there is a season where they are incredibly sensitive to those things that they have cut out because they're not supportive of their bodies, where every time that they consume them, their body is just saying, no, like, I don't want this in here right now. I'm working on healing. This is not the time for this. And then 3, 4, 5 months later, maybe they go back to that same restaurant, eat that exact same meal, and they're like, I feel amazing. And so that is a really great sustainable goal, is keeping in mind, this is not an approach where you're just coming in to cut out all the bad things. That is not sustainable. I don't believe it's sustainable at all to cut out whole foods. I think a lot of that is fueled by orthorexic and disordered eating, and it's a band-aid over the things that are disordered in the way that you are thinking and living, and it can just stay band-aided is that
like
a verb? It can just stay as a band-aid over your life where you're not actually addressing it, because you get to live out your life in an orthorexic approach to food. And so, yeah, I don't believe it's sustainable to just have a black and white cutting of things. But I think that in certain seasons, you can find that it might be more beneficial to really reduce the PUFA content. Whereas months and months later, nut butter sounds amazing to you, and you eat a couple spoonfuls and you feel really nourished by it. And so moderation is key. Being able to realize that the whole goal is building up this rooted grounded resiliency so that you can have freedom in your life in every area is really the goal. And so being able to understand boundaries, loving boundaries, to be able to experience like joy and fulfillment and freedom through your approach to wellness is just an incredible journey that I wish for everyone.
First off, I love that you basically unintentionally defined freely rooted in those last few sentences. Like, I mean, that's exactly what this podcast is about, having healthy boundaries that support you while also feeling the freedom to, you know, pursue nourishment and joy. And I love that. I have to laugh that I basically, like, any overly dogmatic approach that I could have taken with metabolic health, I did. Like all of the stuff that we're talking about today, like, you know, cutting out all cardio because somebody said that maybe, you know, 10 hours of cardio a week is bad. I was the person who was like, okay, no more cardio. Got it. And I was also the person, you know, you guys know if you've been following me on Instagram or probably even listened to the podcast, that I was someone who, needed to gain weight and did gain weight. And I think that I probably even crossed a boundary. It's kind of hard to say about yourself, like really how much weight did I need to gain? Because, you know, I came into this approach at a weight that I thought was too heavy. In hindsight, I'm like, you crazy. Like that weight, I did need to gain weight. But I feel like because I was that person who was like, all right, tomorrow I'm turning my entire life around and I'm upping my calories and I'm adding in this, like I did it way too quickly. And so, you know, my weight gain, I think I can look at now and I think that it was sort of slow and steady, which actually we should talk about this a little bit more, like the difference between, you know, when you're gaining weight, how can we tell if it is supportive and needed versus, you know, if it's overnight? Remind me to come back to that. But,
For sure.
you know, I was somebody who just really dove in and did all of the dogmatic things. And it wasn't the best approach. And I'm not saying I'm not thankful for that, because now I do get to help educate women on, you know, a more appropriate approach to changing into this lifestyle. So let's talk about the weight gain a little bit more. You know, we can't say that everyone will gain weight or nobody will gain weight. We just can't. This is a nuanced conversation. We can't say those statements across the board. Some people will gain, some people won't. And it's honestly just that simple. People who are more likely to need to gain weight are those who have been on restrictive diets for a long time. You know, maybe they were already underweight, which is usually going to be anything under like 18 to 20% body fat. And a lot of the time, you know, don't hold on to this number too tightly because it depends on height, you know, et cetera. But a lot of the time, women that I see who are under like 120 to 130 pounds, they often need to gain weight. Again, don't hold too tightly to that. But I will say at 5'5", when I was 135 pounds, I still needed to gain like 15 or 20 pounds to actually find lasting health. Those numbers aren't across the board, but that's kind of a generic framework of like, okay, you might need to gain weight if you have been dieting for years and years and years and years. Your body weight is super low. Your symptoms are screaming that you're undernourished. You might need to gain weight in that scenario. People who are likely to gain weight but might not need to gain weight are, again, those who dive in just head first way too quickly. You know, adding in calories and high macronutrient ratios overnight. So, you know, if you go from eating 1,300 calories to 2,000 calories within a week, you're going to gain weight. Or if you go from eating, you know, 50 grams of carbs, let's say you're coming from a keto background, and then the next day you decide I'm going to do more like 200 grams of carbs, you're going to gain weight, you know? And Kori and I both talk about reverse dieting, or slowly increasing your calories in, you know, Kori, your course and in my meal plans. And it's important that you follow these, not just for your weight, but your blood sugar regulation, you know, your metabolic health. Like we have to take things slowly in order to support our bodies. So a lot of the time when we see the weight gain, it's because somebody decided, oh, okay, I'm going to follow this dogmatic approach and I'm going to flip the script literally within a couple of days. And then as far as individuals who don't need to gain weight, I would love to have some back and forth on this. But I mean, I would say if you're already overweight, you probably don't need to gain more. And you probably should be losing fat after you start to heal your metabolism. But here's where the conversation gets tricky, because our modern women are terrible at defining what a healthy weight actually is. So I can say that, you know, again, I personally went into metabolic health fully convinced that I needed to lose weight just because I weighed more than I historically had. And this isn't uncommon. I hear so many women say that because they're, you know, I'm not a size 4 anymore and I'm not 120 pounds, that they're convinced they need to lose weight. But if we look at body fat percentages, I think that's truly the most helpful thing,
Mm-hmm.
because I would say that anything over around 35% body fat is when we start getting into that range of, okay, we actually need to pursue weight loss. Women can really thrive from like 20 to, 32, 33-ish percent. And I get that not everyone knows their own body fat number. That's kind of a niche thing to know. Some scales can kind of help you find a general range, or even like you can find like fat pinch tests online to give you kind of a decent picture. But I think it's important to understand that, your personal definition of needing to lose weight for yourself might be a little bit skewed.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Would you agree with that like that's the scenario where, you don't really need to gain weight. You can just kind of like slowly pursue, and healing pounds are not appropriate at that point.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is such an important conversation. Also, this is a very hard conversation to hear. If you are someone that did go in really quickly and you're like, what can I do now?
Mm-hmm.
I'm mad at myself. I'm like, all those feelings are bubbling up. You feel
Yeah.
triggered. This is very human for you to have those feelings while you're listening to this. In fact, I've had a few hard conversations with core students who they came in from a dogmatic approach. I have an entire module dedicated to what happens when you have been dieting and what happens whenever you add in food too quickly. This is exactly what happens. This is how fat cells develop. This is the physiology of it. But they don't want to watch that module. They go straight to the, okay, well, what do I eat? And then they're wondering why they gain weight. And they're realizing, wait, there was an entire module where she told us how to not do this. And this is why I implement a reverse diet, and why Fallon talks about this is because we want to give you guys the tools to be able to avoid any unnecessary weight gain. And so the pattern that I've seen is that if a woman comes in and they understand the physiology of what it means to restrict and then binge and refeed, which would be, that's the exact same thing. If you think about it in the terms of going on a diet and then refeeding, it's the exact same thing as just going from your, past maybe dogmatic way of thinking to, okay, let me go buy gallons of raw milk, gallons of orange juice, put butter on everything, which yes, those are all supportive foods. And again, I've talked about this on the podcast before, and so is Fallon, but this is why I really don't like to do full days of eating, because people are like, okay, screenshotting every slide so they can go and implement that into their days. And I'm like, that is not helpful. That is not loving you guys. That is not serving you guys. What is so much more supportive for you guys is to get connected to your own body and be able to decide on your own when to implement those foods. And so something else I want to add is also what your body starts looking as. Let's say you are someone that needs to gain weight, which we will talk about in a second, like what is healthy weight gain and how your body is carrying that. This is where I find that the conversation of postural alignment and really allowing your body to expand into itself is really, really important. I haven't weighed myself in a few years, but if I had guessed, maybe 30 to 35 pounds heavier than where I was whenever I started my metabolic health journey. However, my hips are so like inches and inches and inches wider, whereas my waist is now tapered because I have worked on expansion in every area. And so where you can get it started with that whole conversation is going and doing these $8, they're called Awaken Your Bow. We have them linked in our tongue tie episodes. And those classes are literally, you're on the floor. It's tedious work on the floor where you are kind of regulating your nervous system and allowing your body to expand in maybe a way that it never has given the opportunity to expand before. So you're actually doing kind of infant poses where you're allowing your hips to open and get wide. And I look at my hips from whenever I was younger to now. I always had these crazy narrow hips. And now I'm realizing that was restriction. I was restricted. And now that I've expanded into myself, and yes, now I'm buying sizes that are way above what I used to buy. My hips do not fit into shorts that I wore even like a year or two ago, or jeans, or even my overalls, any of that, because my hips have been able to expand. And when that happens, your body is allowed to fall into the appropriate proportions of where it wants to sit with these womanly curves that you have developed for yourself. And so that kind of brings the conversation of just curves into this, and the fact that women, as the life givers of this world, are supposed to be curvy and soft and wavy. And this idea of women having your abs showing, or a six pack, or a flat stomach, like, absolutely not. That is not how our physiology actually wants to express in our bodies. We want softness and roundness. And it's so interesting to see how we talked about this on Kitty Blomfield's podcast, but how my own idea of beauty has changed over the years. When I was more in the fitness culture, I literally thought that being fit or having a beautiful body meant you have a flat stomach. And I'm just like, I see a fertile, go take a gander at a Greek statue of a woman. This girl, the Strong Mermaid, I think is her name on Instagram. She talks about this. You know what? I don't want to butcher her name, so I'm going to put it in the show notes, whatever it is, because I want you guys to go find this picture. But it's this picture of this very womanly Greek statue who probably is around, if I had to guess, maybe 32%, 33% body fat. And I'm like, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen right there. Like just soft and curvy and fertile, just looks so fertile and nourished and healthy. And it's not going to be overnight that your idea of beauty within your own body is going to change. It's not going to be overnight. This was years for me to be able to get to a place where I was like, I am so attracted to the softness of the way that a woman's body can hold herself. Yeah, just the idea of a low body fat percentage. If you think about that biologically, it makes so much more sense.
Yeah, for sure. And this is such a refreshing conversation, because I can agree. It's taken me years to kind of shift the way that I see myself, the sort of like, I don't know, aspirations that I have. Like, I think like most women, I was always kind of that girl that wanted to look like, I don't know, certain celebrities or whoever. And like the reality is that most of those women have severely low body fat percentages. And now I see images of women who are just like immediately I can tell someone who's undernourished or too thin. And my head doesn't go to that space of like, man, I wish I looked like them. I find myself being reminded of like the health and the vibrancy that I feel now, that I just feel healthy and like I'm full of life. And I didn't feel that when I was, super, super thin, and I don't look like it either. I mean, I look back at pictures of myself and I'll only compare, myself to myself. I don't want to loop like other women into this comparison, but I can look back at my own images and think like,
wow,
man, I just have gained a lot of life over this process. I did want to come back to how do we distinguish whether or not our weight gain is too much or if it's necessary. So I'll give kind of my own example first, and then we can break that down, because I think that I can very honestly say with my own journey that I probably needed to gain maybe 15 to 20 pounds. I ended up gaining probably 25 to 30. So still kind of in that range of like what was necessary. Because I did dive in very quickly, I think that I kind of combined the healing pounds with the unnecessary pounds. So for me, I think if I'm remembering correctly, my gain was over probably a year and a half. And it was never more than maybe like a pound a week, which to me feels like, I mean, that's a lot, but it's a very like slow, elongated approach, right? I think that sometimes we see women who are like, I gained 10 pounds in a month. And we're like, what? what were you doing? And so I would love for you to touch on that a little bit more. But I think to me that more, if it's taking you a month to gain 10 pounds, I think something's off. And I say that with grace and with, as much like gentleness as I can, because I get it. And I understand that desire to just really separate yourself from such restrictive eating. And you want to, turn around and eat 2,000 calories the next day. And again, just to quickly touch on this, some of us need the quicker approach. Okay. What I want you to hear if you're listening and you're like, oh my gosh, I went in so fast and I gained weight. Some of us needed to do that. Okay. There are repercussions, but my body, as someone who was eating 7 to 10 foods in various seasons and then found this world of, food freedom and eating all the foods that I, quote, couldn't have for years and years. I needed that safety in my body to be able to go more quickly. Mm-hmm. You may be one of those people. That is okay. We also have to pair that with the knowledge that we may gain some weight and we may dysregulate our blood sugar a little bit. And I think that, again, this idea of being like freely rooted, like you have to be aware of certain maybe consequences or things that could happen as a result of your choices, but you are free to do those things. And maybe it's the most sustainable approach for you to dive in more quickly. For me, I was never going to be the person who increased my calories by, 50 per week. That's just not what I was going to do. And it's not what my body needed. So I want you to both hear that you can have grace on yourself if that's the approach that you took or need to take, and also realize that that approach is probably going to lead to a little bit more weight gain. So you have to decide, for me, I was ready to find health. I didn't really, want to beat myself up about body changes. I was ready to find freedom and health. So if that's you, carry on, figure out what your lines and your boundaries are for what you feel like you can introduce into your diet. And if you can take it slower, great. But some of us just have that personality where we're like, okay, we are ready to go. Like we are ready to find health and freedom. I have rambled on for a long time about this. So Kori, what would you say? Would you agree about the sustainable, weight gain versus rapid? Like what is your definition for rapid versus like sustainable?
So I think that maybe the question that would come up with our audience is, how do we for sure know? The answer across the board, like the way that you can know for sure is by taking a look at what you're eating beforehand and then taking a look at what you're eating now. It doesn't mean you have to like make sure that you track your food when you begin, although that is ideal because then you would actually know how much has been added and how quickly it has been added. What you can do is actually pull up, is it chronometer or chronometer? I always say chronometer.
I never know which is right, but
we'll say chronometer.
Yeah.
So one thing you can do is actually plug in a full day of eating from the best that you remember of what a full day of eating looked like for you back then. And then what you can do is plug in a full day of eating for what you're eating now. So 2 different days. And then just be able to compare calorically and then macronutrient wise, like how big of a jump did I take and how quickly of a jump did I take? And so that way you're able to know if weight gain is happening, you can nail down like, why is it happening? And that way I don't have to just go, the healing pounds are hard. They may not be healing pounds. They might be your body binging after a restricted period. And this is typically what happens when someone goes and tracks their food in my course community is, oh my gosh, I jumped up 1,500 calories in a few days. Of course, this is why I'm gaining weight. Now I need to go and adjust my macros and adjust my calories and be able to be at a place that's a little more sustainable, to be able to kind of taper off the rapid weight gain and then be able to get to a place where I just kind of coast with it. And so, yes, I think that people's bodies are going to respond differently as far as exactly how many pounds, like Fallon was saying. But yeah, I would say if you are gaining a whole bunch of pounds in the span of a month, then I would highly encourage you go to reevaluate this, not only because you're probably uncomfortable and you're probably confused, but also because of your long-term health. And also like, I don't want you to get to a place where you're having to work years and years to shed off 40 or 50 pounds that came on because of the huge jump. I don't know if you guys have studied Dr. Lane Norton's work at all, but he was the first guy that got me into metabolic health and the study of diets. But he was able to see that even overnight, like he's in the more bodybuilding realm. And so he was more interested in these people that would go do these bodybuilding competitions, get down to like 1,300, 1,500 calories. Back when I did a bodybuilding competition, I got down to 1,700. And then I did a meticulous refeed reverse diet after that because I had thankfully found his work before then, where he was seeing that these bodybuilders who were getting down to this extremely low calorie amount would go to dinner that night and just binge on like a 5-course meal and then wake up literally 10 to 15 pounds heavier. And it was not just water weight. He was able to see that they were able to gain fat cells literally overnight because the jump was that big. And so
oh my gosh,
we have to logically think, like, does this make sense to just be able to gorge on food after restricting? And maybe some of you didn't come from the super low calorie restriction, or maybe didn't consciously, but it was still lower than what your body actually needed. And then when you add these higher fat, higher carb foods, like Fallon was talking about, that's where it can be confusing because you're like, these foods are so like nourishing. And so like, why would I be gaining so much weight from it? But they are on the higher fat, higher carb side. And especially if you came from not eating a lot of animal products and were eating a very low fat diet, or if you were doing just like your typical like low fat, I think is that Weight Watchers? I can't even remember now. Atkins. I think like Atkins is more of like the low fat. Then understanding how many calories, fat calories are 9 calories per gram. So they're the most calorically dense macronutrient. And so it would make sense why when you add something like whole raw milk or butter, how the calories could jump up really, really quickly before, here's the caveat, before your metabolism is ready. So that's why we work with our metabolism and slowly increase our body's ability to efficiently utilize food while we're incorporating more food. And it is, I mean, I will say, yeah, it can be tedious. And like Fallon was saying, I love that she has taken full honor, like full grace for where she was in that state of like, I never would have done the 50 calorie increases per week. That doesn't even like, you were not in a state where you had gone so long, so restricted. And it makes so much sense to me why you were like, you know what? I'm just going to feed my body. I'm just going to feed my body. And so I hope you guys hear the nuance in that conversation where like, we just so honor where you're at. And we don't want to take an approach where we're like, it's so bad or it's so wrong to not do this tedious reverse diet, because yes, it is tedious and you have to choose the natural consequences for which route you want to take, because you have freedom to do that. So it's your body and you have freedom. And so you get to decide how you want to move forward. And I think being able to just make a conscious decision is the only thing that matters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And then kind of as a wrap up to the weight thing, because I know, a lot of people do like numbers. So I think a common question too is like, how many pounds is enough? If I actually need healing pounds. And I think, again, it's tricky to say anything across the board, but I feel like as a general rule of thumb, if you have started this approach and you are upwards of, 30 to 40 pounds of weight gained, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think we should be gaining 40 to 50 pounds in this approach unless you started out as a 95-pound woman. I don't think that we need to be gaining 40, 50 pounds. So if you have found yourself there, I think that we can redirect a little bit and we can come to the graceful conclusion that maybe some things need to shift. But I know that people also want to hear kind of a number range. I think that, kind of the standard like healing pounds range, 15, 20, 25 pounds might be supportive for you. I think upwards of 30 plus pounds, I think we need to do some reevaluating. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And especially what you said about where did you start? It all depends on where you start. And so, yeah, if you started at, like Fallon said, under 100 pounds or 110, 115, and you are 5'5", 5'6", and you can see, take an honest evaluation for yourself, which you might not be able to see at this moment. And that's another nuanced conversation, is like, we don't have great perception if we're still in kind of like a dysregulated, undernourished state. We don't really have great perception of what our body looks like. Back when I was super, super tiny, I didn't think I was tiny. I didn't think I was too low of a body fat percentage. But now that I'm in this healthy state, I look back and I'm like, how in the world did I not see that? So we understand that like there is also the conversation of like, we may not be able to see it. And this is where that's difficult to be honest with ourselves. But I think if we are gaining weight and it's going to maybe our stomach or something, that can kind of freak us out because maybe we were used to seeing our abs in the past or whatever. So like it is a new beginning of sorts of being able to be like, what does a nourished womanly body look like? And is it possible that my body wants to step into this womanly state for the first time in my life? And am I going to allow that? That doesn't mean you need to gain 40 pounds, but I'm saying if we are honest with ourselves and are looking at ourselves and going, do I look curvy and womanly and round and soft and fertile? And if we don't, like we may need to get up to that state. And so, yeah, just being super honest with ourselves is just really, really, really important. So yeah.
For sure. And I know we need to move on from the weight piece, but it's really one of the most common things that comes up, I think, for both of us in terms of, frequently asked questions. So I think as a final cap off before we move on, we still have several points to cover, but the weight conversation is really so great. I think let's cap this off before we start the next point to give a 10,000 foot view of, if you have found yourself in this place, you've gained too much, you are regretting that you dove in too quickly. Let's talk about some steps moving forward. I'll kind of share some things that I, would say personally. And then Kori, if you want to wrap up, and then we'll definitely move on to the next point. But this is just such a good one. So I'd say, here's what I've done personally.
I love it.
When I felt like, oh my gosh, this weight gain is rapid. Absolute number one thing, if you're not strength training, start. That was the big thing to me, or for me rather, when I started strength training consistently, is when my weight stopped going up. Mind you, I think that was also the perfect place of peace in my body where I did feel ready to stop gaining weight, because again, I think the majority of my weight gain was healing weight. But once I started strength training consistently and intentionally, I think that that's another big thing about strength training, is that this like willy-nilly, like what I used to do, here's my former workout approach, like get on Pinterest, find a 30-minute like kettlebell workout or whatever, find, some random thing. And that's what I did occasionally. I think exercise needs to be intentional. Kori has a lot of great stuff about exercise in her course that gives you a really intentional approach. So, when I say go start strength training, I don't mean like find a different Pinterest workout every time. It needs to be those, fundamental movements of, squat, push, pull, hinge, lunge. That kind of thing should be the basis of your exercise. From then, I would evaluate your fat intake. Again, high carb, high fat is a recipe for weight gain. Because the metabolic approach does prioritize carbs as our body's fuel source, you do want to evaluate, okay, is my fat getting into the like 100-gram range? That paired with, 250 grams of carbs in a day is just going to be too much. Are you eating enough protein? If you're still eating 70 grams of protein, that's not enough. I think that we would like to aim for 100 grams plus in a day, depending on what your body weight is. Other things to consider: stress. I mean, are you super stressed out? I think I can look back at my own journey, and my weight gain was in the midst of, one, when COVID had started. And so the world was just super stressed out as a whole. Everybody we knew was stressed. We were stressed out for one reason or the other. We had a newborn at the time. Stress can play a huge part in your weight, getting outside, regulating your hormones, daily carrot salad. Those are things that I would evaluate. Are you doing the basis? Are you meeting the needs of your metabolism at this point? When your metabolism increases, you're going to need more nutrients. So I actually have kind of discovered recently, this feels like the most ironic thing I've ever said, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it. I wasn't eating enough for a while. And I finally realized that. I cannot believe that I, of all people, I feel like I'm the queen of like, are you eating enough? And I tracked for a couple of days and I was like, that was so much food. And it was like 2,200 calories, which like I burn more than that in a day, even without exercise. I mean, I have 3 young children. Like, moms of young kids usually need probably 2,400 plus calories. And so that's another thing too. You may not be eating enough. It may not be that you're overeating. Your metabolism may have downregulated to accommodate that you've got high stress, your nutrient needs are higher, and then you're not eating enough. Kori, what do you want to tack on to that? I'm forgetting like a billion things, but what can we do to start prioritizing healthy fat loss?
Yeah. So walking is a huge, huge one. And I know that Fallon totally incorporated that in her rhythms as well, but walk daily and make movement definitely a daily rhythm in your life instead of throwing out all the movement. Find something that you love, find something that you enjoy, play, add just like playfulness in your life, especially if you're a parent. Like, go play with your kids outside, experience life through their eyes. It sounds self-explanatory, but like, you can be playing with your kids and playing with your kids. You know what I mean? Like, there's being able to meet them in their own joy and playfulness, and then just kind of being there and kind of being in your head. And so, yeah, playfulness, getting out in nature, being able to regulate your nervous system, also being able to examine if there is a past something that we are holding on to. Because if you think about weight, our body's holding on to things. And so looking at the emotional and spiritual side of like, what am I holding on to in my life, and being able to release those things, examining that. And then also just like being able to, like Fallon said, track your calories. And then lastly, I know I said this before, but working on expansion in all areas of life, even though I know you're like, wait, but my body's expanding and that's not what I want. What I'm saying is like, the time has like come and gone of this era where women's bodies were being told to be made small and tighter and smaller and tighter and smaller and sucking in our bellies. All of that is atrocious for our pelvic diaphragm, first of all, but also just not supportive of our body's ability to carry and birth children either. And so I remember, I actually just looked at this picture the other day. I had done a popular ab rehab program after the birth of Koa, my son. And that was back when I was very much into like stand up straight and have a flat back and a flat stomach and like just in that mindset. And so I was attracted to this particular ab rehab program that was very much focused on tight and in and making yourself small. And what happened to my body at the end of that program is my body resembled a prepubescent boy's body. It was like straight up and down, narrow hips. Yes, I had a flat stomach, but I was just straight up and down. And then after the birth of my daughter, I was like, enough of this, like sucking in culture. Like my body needs to curve and wave and be soft. And so I did those Awaken Your Bow classes. I've been doing them twice a week. And I've just watched how my hips are actually wider than they were when I was pregnant. How is that possible? But they are. And like, I've watched my body grow into the areas where I have kept myself in my whole life, even since I was probably a little girl. And so what's interesting is I come from a family of narrow hips, and I wonder how much of that has been generational trauma that has been passed down and things that we've held on to as generations and generations. And I feel like I'm releasing literally like generations of belief systems about our bodies. And also just like, this all sounds very woo woo, but
I love it.
it's taking the emotional and spiritual side as well. And so if you think about a baby, if you think about like a time when you've put like a really, really tight diaper on a baby, you know how it makes this baby body where their bellies are big and the diaper's too tight and then their legs are big. That kind of happens as adults when we start gaining weight and we're not allowing our bodies to expand like it should. So if you think about it, you might be gaining weight into an appropriate way, but your body is not allowing for the appropriate proportion. So what if this weight gain is the first step to you being able to expand in your body as a woman for the first time in your life and grow breasts for the first time in your life and hips and a soft belly? And so our jobs can also be to examine the emotional and spiritual side and then allow the actual hourglass to grow as it should. I can't believe that I no longer have narrow hips. That's insane to me. So that's another thing that I'd like to add in. And then moving on to, can you tell that we haven't recorded in a while? We're just like,
well, also this topic, I feel like we always want to talk about this. So this was solid.
Totally. I mean, I hope you guys just enjoy this because this is just a great, like, coffee shop style conversation. But moving on to our third point is the idea that everyone in the pro-metabolic or the metabolic health community believes the same thing. This is not true. We are all like, why would we believe the exact same thing? Who do you know in your life that believes the exact same thing as you? We're all individuals with our own bodies and lifestyles and resources and education. And then going back to the point I made before, the metabolic health community is not authoritarian. And if you think about it, for an authoritarian approach, that means that like one person's at the top or a group of people, and they're telling everybody else, like, this is the only way. And this is essentially the foundation of what I was talking about earlier with the name of our podcast. Fallon actually helped me come up with this name for my course as well. But like when you are grounded and rooted in the foundational principles that support your physiology objectively, because a lot of what we talk about is objective, you have the freedom, because you are resilient, like we talked about earlier, to be able to take an individualist approach from there. And so an example of this would be one person might teach that alcohol doesn't support your hormones and you should never drink it, period. Whereas another person might teach that, yeah, it's not great, but like, here's how you can consume it in small amounts supportively. And then another person might say, hey, alcohol in small amounts isn't a big deal. Here's how you do it supportively, but also kind of what I was talking about earlier, there are different phases of healing. So your body might reject it right now, whereas it might not reject it 6 months from now. So you can see the nuance in that, where everyone has their own experimentation. And also that's why I love that I have this course community, because I get to just observe what thousands of women are doing and what's working for them and what's not, and be able to honor like, wow, there is so much nuance in this conversation. And the phases of the timelines of healing are always like really fascinating to me. But yeah, I think the bigger question here is, are you comfortable if these people in the metabolic health community don't all agree with each other? Are you comfortable with the idea of you needing to figure out some of this stuff on your own? And so I think that is the bigger question to ask, instead of being like triggered because this person changed their mind about this and this person, like, and they all seem to be disagreeing with each other. Maybe it's an invitation for us to take radical responsibility and ownership of kind of just taking what resonates with us from each person. I mean, that is true ownership right there, of being able to be like, wow, I can hold my mentor says this about, the true sign of intelligence being able to hold two opposing views at the same time instead of this is the only right way and everybody else is wrong. That is such a sign of dysregulation. It is not even funny. And I see it all the time in the nutrition sphere. And we can also see that with like certain types of diets that are incredibly restrictive, and then seeing kind of the nervous system response that comes from being in a state of undernourishment. And so I think that's what is so beautiful about these people in the metabolic health community is that everyone is able to appreciate the nuance, and everyone I've seen at least. And so that's why there is no authoritarian approach. Everyone can disagree with each other on little things. And so, yeah, just use discernment also on just like who you're consuming content from, including us. We haven't been studying Ray Peat's work for 10 plus years, like some people like Josh and Jeannie Rubin have, or Danny Roddy has. We're still in our first 4 to 5 years of diving into his work specifically. Of course, I've had a fascination with metabolic health since about 2012, but I didn't discover Dr. Ray Peat until I think it was 2018, about the same for Fallon. And so we're still experimenting. We're still learning. We're also observing. We're observing the anecdotal and the nuanced conversation of it all among our own communities. But it kind of brings me to the last point I want to make is that Fallon and I noticed that sometime in 2021, the metabolic health community kind of exploded within a few like niche holistic communities, which is incredible. I feel like it finally got to kind of like if they would call themselves like the crunchy mom group. And so what happened is like it looked like it was becoming a fad and almost cultish, even though it was still very fringe because it was just exploding within those little communities. But I do think a couple things happened when that happened. Number one, I think certain influencers kind of made it, quote, sexy, if that makes sense. And so I think this is where a lot of those conversations have come up where people are like, oh yeah, pro-metabolic eating, it's just about gummies and orange juice, right? Like that's what I see. Whereas I personally have never seen anybody talk about this. I've never seen someone say pro-metabolic eating is about marshmallows and gummies, but I can see how some of the influencers might have kind of sexified it. Oh my gosh, is that even a word? In a way where like, where it is now. I'm making up a lot of words on here. I can see how it has become to look kind of fad-ish, and also why that's a turnoff to people. Like, I'm with you. I'm with you there. I can see how it is that way. And then I think another thing is a whole bunch of people realized it was exploding and started using it as maybe a business opportunity without maybe understanding the foundational roots of what they're selling. And so this is where I've seen more and more of that fad and black and white language come in, which again tells me more about where that person is at versus what they're actually sharing about. It's so much more of a reflection of where they're at, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was perfectly said. And I think that it's super important that you touched on this, that, even Kori and I have watched my view of things shift, I think, in a healthy way over the years. I think that changing your opinion is not something to be ashamed of. I think it's actually a sign of health and regulation, that you can actually look at something objectively and say, you know what, I made a mistake and I feel like I need to change this a little bit. And some of you guys know, I mean, I even like reformulated my meal plans not that long ago because I think differently than I did a couple of years ago. And they were small. I mean, it's virtually the same product, but there are small changes just to, again, prove this point that we can change our minds. It is okay to morph and shift as you learn more things. And then the last thing I want to say on this before we go to the next point is that I want to encourage you, listener, if you are somebody who feels like you dive into every new rabbit hole, do not feel like you have to, and I have set this boundary for myself. Sometimes new things come up on Instagram from accounts that I trust and who have shared new information. And I have to pause and say, I am not ready to dive into this. There may come a day where I am ready, but today is not that day. And I think that's an okay boundary to set, that you do not have to go down every new rabbit hole that somebody presents. If you feel the mental capacity to do that in that moment, go for it. But a lot of us are not ready for that. We're still trying to learn kind of the fundamental beliefs that we hold. And it's okay if you're not ready for, a complete 180 on something that you've held on to for years and years. So just to give yourself that grace, I try to give myself that grace. Sometimes we're just not ready to dive into a new topic or totally change our view on a certain topic. Kori, you brought this up. Such a good conversation. The next point we want to cover is that, this idea that like everyone's diet should look the same. and you have to include gummies, you have to drink orange juice, you have to eat marshmallows. This is something we want to break down and show you guys that it's not something that anyone is requiring of you. So I think those of us who did step into metabolic eating, again, from this dogmatic background and, tend to function off black and white thinking, can really easily fall into this trap of trying to exactly replicate somebody else's diet. And I can think of several people off the top of my head who eat pro-metabolically, who eat differently than I do. And I think that there's a couple of truths we can hold at the same time. One, there are certain nutrient dense foods that tend to work well and support your metabolism. That might be dairy, sourdough, orange juice, gummies, potatoes. The second truth that we can hold is that many people will need to tweak some things to fit their personal needs. I can say from my own experience that I, again, dove headfirst into this approach and started including sourdough because it was a pro-metabolic food. And my body was like, hey, we're not ready for this. And I had to backtrack a little bit because I wasn't long fermenting. I wasn't, it was just like Costco sourdough. And I'm like, yeah, sourdough's on the yes list. So I just dove in and my body was like, hey, can we actually step back for a second? And I want to encourage you that that's okay. I know many people who have the same issue. They've gone from low carb to, eating rice with every meal and potatoes, and they've gained a ton of weight and messed up their blood sugar. A lot of these more metabolically supportive foods are things that have been avoided in your individual diet for a long time. A lot of us stepping into this, we haven't done, dairy or potatoes or rice or tons of fruit. It's going to take our bodies time to adjust. And, because the mainstream health culture would say, to cut dairy and cut fruit and cut animal products. If we're coming from a background like that, we need a little bit more time. We need a slower adjustment period before we can add them in. Or maybe you're not sourcing them properly. Is it really that you can't tolerate milk? Or maybe is it that you're buying conventional milk with added vitamins still? Can your body not handle grains, or are you maybe not soaking and sprouting them first? There's a lot of things that come into this conversation, and I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty, for like every single food, but I just want to encourage you to leave room to evaluate, why is a food not working for me? And if at the end of the day, you can't include something currently that's like quintessentially pro-metabolic, have grace on yourself. Like if you're not ready for dairy, don't eat dairy. Like I have so many messages from people who are like, oh, I just can't tolerate dairy. Like, how am I going to do this approach? And I'm like, you do it without dairy. Like there's room for that. And I even have a post on my Instagram feed about pursuing metabolic health and mineral health if you can't include dairy. So I just want to say, like, there's room for you to support your body still, even if you have to introduce, red meat a bit more slowly, or dairy a bit more slowly, or adrenal cocktails a little bit differently. Like if you're having blood sugar issues with adrenal cocktails, change the way that you're drinking them. It's not this like, you just have to do these list of foods and make it work. And if your body is not handling that, like, sorry, you're out of the pro-metabolic club. Like we have to adjust sometimes and just figure out what's working. And I mean, I've literally had people tell me, again, they can't pursue metabolic health because like, I don't like gummies. So like, I can't pursue metabolic health. And I'm like, you don't have to eat gummies. Nobody said you had to eat gummies. If you love them and they work for you, awesome. I personally love gummies and they work super well for me and for my family. But if you can't eat gummies, like get gelatin through bone broth or like, slow cooked bone in meats. There's just so much nuance to this conversation. And I think the biggest thing is to always make sure you're pursuing nutrients. It doesn't matter what you see me eating or Kori eating or anybody else for that matter. Does it work for you? And are you consistently supporting, your overall nutrient intake and your personal subjective markers? How's your digestion? How are your temperatures? Like if those things are in balance, your food, can be decided on an individual basis from there. So just like take all of this extra out of the conversation and figure out, is this supportive to me as a person?
That was that was awesome, especially considering that, like, I love that you touched on gummies because gummies are more of like a fun and supportive way to be able to mimic the nose to tail eating. And so, like Fallon was saying, nowhere are they a requirement. It's a way that you can incorporate and bring back nose to tail eating into your life. However, if you love making your own bone broth, like that's amazing too. So there's no black and white way to approach it. And then the last thing that we want to touch on as far as a misconception is that it's only or it's all about what you're eating. And this might actually sound contradicting, maybe even to like how we have spoken in the beginning of our episode, because we were talking about how healing food is and how important nutrition is and how important it is to build up your capacity. However, later on in the episodes, when we started bringing in that mind and that spirit piece, the body and the mind and the spirit piece, you guys might have started to examine like, what are some stressors on my life and what are some other things that I can be viewing objectively? And that's kind of the whole point, is we can't get to a place where we can view stressors in our life with clarity and with objectivity without building up capacity first. That's why the food piece is so important as a first step element, because you're building up that capacity to be able to change even our brains. And so Samantha Naturally actually and I did a live on this. It's called Addressing Trauma on Your Healing Journey. And we talked about why it makes sense that it comes up later after you've built the foundational resiliency through your nutritional approaches and through like building back up your mineral stores, because trauma even has an effect on your mineral status. And so being able to build back up those minerals to be able to even address your trauma is something that's really important. But I thought I would give you guys some practical tips on how I kind of examine spiritual or emotional pieces when a symptom comes up. And so the reason I mention this as a misconception is because I often get emails, messages, or even questions from my course students going, hey, this is my symptom. What am I deficient in? What am I deficient in? What am I deficient in? And that seems to be the common question of just like, what food, what mineral, what nutrient am I deficient in? Whereas that is not always the answer. I believe that if you have built a really strong foundation, this is where those other pieces come up. So one way that I like to examine this is through Louise Hay's work. So Louise Hay. She has a book called, I think it's called How to Heal Your Body. I'll leave it in the show notes so you guys don't have to go off my memory. Another way to approach it is by looking into German New Medicine. So German New Medicine, the guy that started it, I believe, was a cancer physician in Germany. And he was seeing these connections between the emotional pieces and the spiritual pieces with the symptoms that were showing up in the body. And what's interesting is I've read a few books about like the spiritual roots of disease, the spiritual roots of symptoms. And then also my chiropractor back in Florida was very interested in this conversation. And what I found was fascinating, as much as as much as some people want to go, oh, that's woo woo. Oh, like I don't. And also like I had this conversation with somebody the other day. They were triggered because they were like, oh no, I'm doing something wrong. And I'm like, okay, that would be a core belief that we have about ourselves of like, we're doing something wrong. However, if we're able to zoom out and look at the big picture and realize like symptoms express themselves as a result of all three, then we can really look into, and again, have the capacity to be able to examine the emotional and spiritual pieces. So anyways, this might sound all very woo-woo. However, unanimously, my chiropractor, this German physician who started German New Medicine, and then Louise Hay's work, all unanimously I found across symptoms are the same thing. These people are completely separate from each other.
Wow.
But I'll give you an example. Is my chiropractor, back when I was going to him back in Florida, we were talking about breast cancer. And he was like, in breast cancer patients that I worked with, 100% of them were in a marriage where the husband was not faithful. There was some sort of affair that happened and the wife took on a feeling of bitterness. And that manifested itself in breast cancer in her body. And it wasn't until she actually addressed the emotional trauma of that she was actually able to heal. And what's interesting is in German New Medicine, they even go down to like the left versus the right breast, what kind of conflict it is. The right breast might mean a partner conflict, whereas the left one might mean a mother-child conflict. You can really have a lot of curiosity with it, and just if it helps, like going into something like that where you're like, I'm not going to put, a lot of weight to this. I'm just going to have this, exist and take it with a grain of salt. However, how can I flex my curiosity in a way to be able to examine with honesty, like, is there something emotional going on here? I'll give an example of my own personal life story. My daughter, when she was 10 months old, I believe, the longest I've been away from her is 2 hours. And I went and brought somebody a postpartum meal, like maybe like 35 or 40 minutes away, and then wanted to hang out with her and love on her and hear her birth story. And it turns out that I was away from Story for about 4 hours. So it was the longest I had been away from her. And I also felt a little bit of anxiousness of like, I need to get back with my daughter. I felt something energetically where I was just like, I feel like she wants me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was getting home and I kind of felt like a little frazzled in that way of like, I need to get back to her. And what's interesting is that night she developed thrush, oral thrush. And that was her only symptom of any kind of like thrush or like candida type thing. But whenever I looked up on German New Medicine, what does oral thrush mean? It said oral thrush is the emotional meaning of why that symptom would present itself is actually distress that they will not get breast milk. And I thought that was so interesting that like the longest I was away from Story, and also we do this thing, I'm sure you guys do this thing with your kids too, when they can't quite communicate yet, you still set an intention where you're like, hey, I'm going to go here and I'm going to be back. Even if they don't understand you, I really do believe that they feel that. And I was in a hurry when I left the house too. And I never had that exchange with her where I just really set that intention with her. And so I wasn't surprised at all. And also Kyle, my husband, said she had a really hard time the last hour. And that's interesting because I was feeling really anxious about getting back with her. And so I just find that very interesting that like for German New Medicine to lay that out as like, this is thrush. And that was the longest time I was away from Story. And she was hungry and she did want milk. And that would just be a personal example in my life. I use German New Medicine all the time as a parallel with Louise Hay's work because they like to complement each other a lot. But I do think that we have to also be at a pretty healthy and objective place to be able to examine these things. So again, going back to the idea of building up capacity with food and nutrition first, our lifestyle first, kind of water we drink, are we grounded? Do we get good sunlight? Are we in nature? And then being able to be at a place where we can examine those emotional pieces without getting triggered and kind of spiral and go down maybe a different type of rabbit hole where we, you know, spiral into core beliefs about ourselves and then maybe even distress about our relationship with our child and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, but I think anytime that you find yourself constantly looking to food of like, well, the food must be the problem or the lack of food must be the problem. If you're at a good place now where it feels like it resonates to you, I would explore those additional pieces of the emotional and spiritual symptoms.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think that's something that keeps coming up on my own health journey too. You know, I've worked with a couple of metabolic nutritionists and dietitians who have looked at my stuff on paper and, you know, I'm complaining about whatever symptom and they're like, you shouldn't change anything. Like your nutrition is perfection. Don't change it. And then the question is, what else is going on? You know, are you stressed? Are you having fun? Are you playing? Is there emotional baggage that you're hanging on to? And so even for me personally, I've started implementing more EFT and tapping this past week because I think that, you know, the brain component of this, the neurological component of this, you know, the spiritual, emotional, like all of it is just at play. And we can't ignore that. We can't just say, you know, oh, it's just the food. The food is important. Like we said, like, yes, do the food stuff. The food stuff is so important, but there probably is some other stuff going on. And I think that this is just such a great conversation because I think so many women do feel like, hey, I've checked all the boxes and something is missing. And so I think this could be a fantastic next thing to dive into. If you feel like, you know, my nutrition is fantastic, there's nothing else for me to do. Maybe start looking at your emotional health. Maybe start looking at the, you know, recurring messages that you are saying to yourself in your head. You know, even with the weight stuff, like if we're constantly saying, I'm too heavy, I'm never going to lose weight, you know, this symptom's never going to go away, I'm never going to have enough energy, whatever it is, you repeat that to yourself over and over and over, and it will become your reality. This is not like you know, we keep saying like, this sounds kind of woo-woo. It's not a woo-woo thing. It's neuroscience. Like this is the way that our brains work. We form pathways based on the repeated information that we give ourselves. So I think that, you know, yeah, if you're stuck in a rut, you're doing all the stuff nutritionally that you could possibly be doing. Don't ignore the rest of it. Don't ignore the messages that you're telling yourself. You know, don't ignore the stress component, the spiritual, emotional component. And I love, Kori, I feel like this is still a new conversation to me, the German New Medicine connection and, you know, this emotional link is just so interesting. So I'm really glad this came up today. Yeah, I feel like we just have to step back sometimes from all the rules and look at our body as a whole.
Yeah. And I think that the last thing I'll say about the whole emotional and spiritual side is what I've found 100% of the time that I've introduced someone to, like, if they ask me a question of just like, do you know what's going on? And I'm like, well, let's look at this from German New Medicine. If I know that they're in a place where like they could examine this, 100% of the time they have come back saying, whoa, this is exactly what it was. And when I addressed it, everything went away. And so I think that this is similar to like even the nutrition concept of just like, yeah, this might sound very out there and not something that you are not a familiar territory to you, but self-experimentation is where we keep coming back to this idea of self-experimentation being like quite literally the most important part of your healing journey. So just self-experiment with it. Like I said, take it with a grain of salt. If you want, just be curious about your body and like what your body is trying to communicate with you. And so when you look at the German New Medicine pieces, it makes sense with the ideas of the kind of like symptoms that come up. So yeah, I really appreciate, and I love the conversation of the emotional and spiritual pieces. But to wrap that up, thank you guys so much for listening to this first episode of season 4. Now that we're on YouTube, this is kind of fun to be able to do a video version as well. And make sure you check out the website for show notes and links and our transcripts, and then follow and subscribe to the show, leave a review. We love to read your reviews, and we will see you guys next week.